Well, welcome to episode 335 of 10 Minute Record Reviews. And this time I'm going to talk about this record by John Coltrane from 1961, Ole Coltrane. This is not a 1961 first pressing, it's actually a 2017 Atlantic/Rhino Records release in mono. The book appears to be that the stereo pressing is actually preferable. I actually have a 1962 US stereo press on the way, and maybe I'll do a bit of an addendum to this video when I get that record. In terms of what to expect, well, this is Coltrane's last record for Atlantic. It's a sextet record, and it includes three of the four members of the soon-to-be famous Coltrane Classic Quartet in place. Everybody except Jimmy Garrison is here. And stylistically, it's a step forward, I think, from his previous record, which was very famous and very well received, My Favorite Things. That record to me sounds like a 1950s record. This is very much of a piece with his work in the 60s, with the work he would do in Impulse, and there's a lot of distance that he's covered musically in that 7 or 8 months. In early 1961, when John Coltrane's contract with Atlantic was winding down, his musical life was squarely back on the rails compared to what it had been, say, 2 or 3 years before. From 1957 to 1958, the year that he got clean, he also went through a major period of musical growth. He does this 6-month apprenticeship with Monk. He rejoins Miles. He's part of Miles's move towards modal jazz, which culminates in Kind of Blue. And on the strength of that, he then goes on to sign the first big record deal of his life with Atlantic in 1959, and he goes on to make a whole series of classic records. Those include Giant Steps and Coltrane Jazz, released in 1960 and 1961, respectively, My Favorite Things, also from 1961, and this record. If I'd been paying proper attention to sequence, I probably should have reviewed My Favorite Things first, but I actually like this record better and I couldn't wait. The sound of this record is a manifestation of two big areas of change for Coltrane at the beginning of the 1960s, the expansion of his musical vocabulary and the sound of his still forming quartet. It hadn't taken him long after he'd joined Davis for the second time to want to leave, and he'd actually been trying to get out of the Davis group since early 1959. He couldn't find a replacement. He was still with Davis by the fall of 1959, but at that point, Davis was getting interested in his work with Gil Evans, and so Coltrane had a fair amount of time for himself that fall to think about what his sound was that he wanted to articulate and who he wanted to play it with. He agreed with Miles that he would go on a tour of Europe in the spring of 1960, but he said, after that, I'm done, I'm out. And in fact, the last appearance that he had as part of Miles Davis's group was in Stuttgart in April of that year. From that point on, Coltrane only led his own groups. But the problem was, at that point, in April 1960, he didn't have his own group. He knew who he wanted. He wanted to have McCoy Tyner on piano. He wanted to have Elvin Jones on drums. He wanted to have Art Davis on bass, but none of them were available because Tyner was playing with Golson and Farmer in the Jazztet. Jones was temporarily locked up at the pleasure of the American people following a heroin bust, and Art Davis was playing with Dizzy Gillespie. So Coltrane has to improvise. And when he hits the clubs in New York in May 1960, he's got a group that includes Pete LaRocca on drums, Steve Kuhn on piano, and Steve Davis, not Art Davis, on bass. That was always going to be temporary, and by September, Coltrane had managed to get hold of 2 of the 3 original members that he'd wanted to join. Tyner had come in within a month to replace Steve Kuhn on piano, and after a brief interregnum with Billy Higgins on drums, Elvin Jones joins up as a free man in September. That group, with Coltrane, Tyner, Jones, and Davis, goes on to make My Favorite Things in October of that year, which of course is a huge hit. But Coltrane is still not happy. In particular, he's not happy with the bass sound, so he brings in Reggie Workman in the beginning of 1961. Workman stays for about a year, but that fit too doesn't quite scratch Coltrane's itch. Reggie Workman is a great bass player, but the problem was that he had a tendency to stick too closely to the patterns that Elvin Jones was playing, and this was a problem in a quartet that Coltrane wanted to be really 4 folks extemporizing as much as possible. At some point, Coltrane says, Reggie, we're a quartet, but if you're going to play basically just everything Elvin does, then we may as well be a trio. Ultimately, Coltrane would, of course, bring in Jimmy Garrison, but during 1961, to get more dynamics out of the bass, every now and then he would bring in a second bass player, typically Art Davis. While the sound of this record reflects that particular iteration of the quartet, it also reflects Coltrane's expanding musical interests. And there are a bunch of different musical threads here. In the Atlantic years, of course, that was the peak of his sheets of sound phase, where you had these incredible runs of 16th notes and 32nd notes and God knows what else. You also had his work with Miles Davis, which shows up on his playing in Milestones and Kind of Blue, that whole move towards modal jazz. Another musical thread, one which kind of comes from out of the blue and really rocks Coltrane's world, is the arrival of Ornette Coleman, that free jazz pioneer and upstart who comes from LA to New York in late 1959. While Coltrane would take his own version of the avant-garde in a slightly different direction than Coleman, he had engaged with Coleman's group and with Coleman himself very early on. He befriended Coleman. He ends up making a record with himself and all of the other members of Coleman's group in the summer of 1960. That ends up getting released, I think, in 66 as the avant-garde. It's okay as a record. It kind of falls between two stools. Coltrane doesn't really fit all that well into Coleman's group, and yet, nevertheless, Coltrane knew this was the future, and it gave him a sense of where he wanted to go with his own music. But all that said, there was still one more musical thread or musical tangent in which Coltrane had an interest, and that was world music. And it was that interest which leads us to this record. This record is made on May 25th, 1961 at A&R Studios in Manhattan. The producer for Atlantic Records is Nsui Erdogan, and the engineer is Phil Ramone. I mentioned that Coltrane had an interest in world music, and this had two main manifestations around this time. The first and probably the biggest one was actually in African music. You can hear that as far back as his work in 1958 with Wilbur Harden on the record, which is variously released, well, certainly as Tanganyika Strut. But it wasn't just African music which had caught his attention. He had really dug the work that Miles had done with Gil Evans on Sketches of Spain, which of course Coltrane had not really been part of. But like Miles, he started digging heavily into Spanish folk music, and he was listening to a lot of that in 1960. And as it happens, both of these interests, African music and Spanish music, resurfaced for Coltrane in 1961. 2 days prior to this session, most of the players on this record had been on another recording session, which was Coltrane's first session for Impulse Records, the one which produces Africa Brass. This is a record on which Gil Evans actually has apparently quite a substantial but uncredited influence. It's a big group setting. There's a whole bunch of different players. It's a very different record from this, and it contains some of the seeds of the avant-garde music, which Coltrane would then revisit at various points in his Impulse catalog. 2 days after that, Coltrane goes back into the studio with a much smaller group, the core of his quartet, plus a couple of other players, to make a record which is much more influenced by Spanish music and is fundamentally different from Africa Brass. Again, this record features three of what would become the classic Coltrane quartet. So you've got Coltrane, who plays tenor on one track, but soprano sax on two. You've got McCoy Tyner on piano. You've got Elvin Jones on drums. On bass is Reggie Workman, with Art Davis sitting in on two of the three tracks. So on two tracks out of the three, you have two basses at play. On trumpet is a fantastic Freddie Hubbard, taking a break from his Blue Note work. Eric Dolphy, the multi-instrumentalist, and by this point a good friend of Coltrane's, is here. He plays flute when Coltrane's on soprano and alto when Coltrane's on tenor. The record starts with the title track, Olé, which of course occupies the entirety of side one. And it begins with a staccato figure on bass, over which Coltrane lays down a melody line, which initially to me sounds a little bit Arabic, but then you realize what he's conjuring up is basically that sound of Moorish Spain. Both Hubbard and Dolphy offer solos in a similar vein, but I think the real star of this track is actually the rhythm section, in particular McCoy Tyner. And those two bass players also do amazingly well here. There's a middle section where they're alternating between plucking and bowing, which is really cool. And then there's this great moment where somebody, I don't know which one of them, is bowing a high line on the bass, and that transitions into a long extended note from Coltrane on the soprano sax, but it's so seamless that you are hard pressed to determine when one instrument stops and the other begins, or at least I was the first couple times I heard it through. Anyway, really, really cool moment. Side two starts with Dahomey Dance, which apparently is built on some of Coltrane's listening to African folk music. It has more in common, I think, with some of his earlier work on Atlantic. The sheets of sound, to the extent that it is present on this record, is most evident on this track. The final track, Aisha, is the only non-Coltrane composition on the record. It's written by McCoy Tyner. It's named after his wife. This, to me, is one of the most beautiful ballads that Coltrane ever recorded. And when I listen to this, every time another solo pops up, I think, oh no, this is the best moment on this record. Oh no, this is the best moment on this record. It's just achingly beautiful, I think. Coltrane's classic quartet was remarkable, but it's kind of tempting to wonder when you listen to this record with Hubbard and Dolphy what this sextet might have achieved had they persevered as a group, which of course was likely never going to happen. I say that because this is a spectacular record. It's no less ambitious than Giant Steps, but in a lot of ways it's more accessible, and it's certainly a very democratic record. Everybody on here has a chance to shine. It contains some of the very best ideas that Coltrane would go on to articulate in his Impulse years. It's a must-have for your Coltrane collection, and for me, it's 5 out of 5 stars.